I thought I was picking up a jacket he'd forgotten on the back of the bedroom chair. Just a jacket, nothing more. One of those small domestic tasks that make up the fabric of a shared life and feel, in their very smallness, like evidence that you belong to someone. Instead, I found a folded piece of paper tucked into the inner pocket, and when I smoothed it open with fingers that already seemed to know something was wrong, I read the words that unraveled 7 years of my life in under a minute. It was a letter, his handwriting, addressed to a woman named Natalie, and it began, "By the time you read this, I will have finally found the courage to leave. But here is the part that fate, with its cold and particular sense of humor, had already arranged on my behalf. Marcus never got to deliver that letter. He never made it to Natalie's apartment that evening. He never got to begin the new life he had apparently been planning for the better part of a year. The life sketched out in careful bullet points on a legal pad I would find later. The life he had been quietly packing for in the storage unit I didn't yet know existed, because 30 minutes before he would have walked out of our front door for the last time, he collapsed on the kitchen floor, and I was the one who called the ambulance. I was the one who rode in the back of that screaming vehicle with my hand wrapped around his, feeling his pulse flicker beneath my fingers like a candle in a draft. I was the one who stayed, and in my other hand, without even realizing I was still clutching it, creased and damp from my grip, was the letter meant for another woman. I need to tell you about the life we had before that afternoon, because without it, none of what happened afterward makes any real sense. You have to understand what I thought we were, what I had built my entire sense of self around, before you can understand the particular and precise quality of the destruction. Our home was a pale yellow house on Maple Creek Drive, the kind of house that looked like it had been designed by someone who had studied photographs of domestic contentment and tried to replicate it from the outside in. Wide front porch with 2 rocking chairs we almost never actually used, a garden I tended on Saturday mornings while Marcus made coffee and brought a mug out to me without being asked, a kitchen that smelled on good evenings of garlic and olive oil and the specific warmth of a life being lived together. That detail, the coffee, used to feel like love to me. The small, wordless gesture of a man who paid attention. I have thought about it many times since, turning it over in my mind like a stone with something unpleasant living underneath it, wondering when exactly the gesture became habit rather than feeling, or whether it had always been more habit than feeling, and I had simply not been willing to notice. My name is Clara. I was 34 years old when this happened, and I had been married to Marcus Hale for 7 years. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, a crowded, noisy apartment in the city, mid-October, the kind of evening where the wine is cheap and the laughter is loud and genuine, and you end up talking to a stranger in the kitchen for 2 hours because the music in the living room is too relentless for anything real. Marcus was tall, quiet in a way that read as thoughtful rather than distant, and he actually listened, when I talked, leaning slightly forward, asking questions that proved he had been paying attention to the answer before. That quality, rare enough among people of any kind, felt like something extraordinary in a man I had just met. I fell in love with the way he paid attention. I think, looking back with the kind of clarity that only comes after the wreckage has settled and you can finally see the full shape of what you were standing in, that I mistook his attentiveness for depth. He was very good at listening. He was considerably less good at feeling. We were happy, or I was happy, which is perhaps not the same thing at all. We bought the yellow house 4 years into our marriage, scraping together a down payment that had taken 18 months of deliberate, unglamorous saving. Eating at home instead of restaurants, skipping vacations, choosing the second-hand couch over the new one, agreeing silently that the future was worth the present's deprivation. I didn't mind the sacrifices. I was building something, or I believed I was. I worked as a senior project manager at a mid-sized architecture firm downtown, a job I was genuinely good at and quietly proud of. The kind of work that required precision and patience and the ability to hold many complicated moving parts in your head simultaneously without letting any of them drop. Marcus worked in finance, something with derivatives and structured products, something I never fully understood despite his occasional attempts to explain it. Something that paid extremely well and seemed, nonetheless, to leave him with a low, persistent dissatisfaction he could never quite name out loud. He had everything he had said he wanted. I think the trouble was exactly that. Looking back, I can identify the precise texture of his restlessness during those last couple of years. It was not the loud restlessness of a man who complains, who slams doors and demands something different. It was quieter and more dangerous than that. It was the restlessness of a man who has decided internally that the life he is living belongs to a version of himself he no longer recognizes, who is already, in every way that matters, somewhere else. He was present and absent simultaneously, like a photograph of someone in a room rather than the person themselves. He laughed less. He touched me less, not in any way that I could point to on a calendar and call a change, just a gradual cooling. The kind that happens so incrementally you keep thinking it's the season rather than the climate. I told myself we were in one of those flat patches that every long marriage moves through and moves out of. I told myself it would pass. I was very practiced at telling myself things that were comforting rather than true. The first concrete sign arrived on a Tuesday in February. I remember because I had an especially difficult project review that morning and had come home tired and quietly irritable, looking forward to nothing more ambitious than a glass of wine and an early night. Marcus was in the kitchen when I came through the front door, but he was standing with his back to me, his phone pressed to his ear, and when he heard the key in the lock, he stiffened in a way I felt in my chest before I consciously registered it. A small, almost imperceptible contraction of his shoulders, the physical vocabulary of someone caught. He ended the call before he turned around. "Work," he said before I asked anything. I hadn't asked. I noticed that I hadn't asked, and I noticed that he had felt compelled to offer an explanation for an unremarkable phone call before I had spoken a single word, and I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind under the category of things that are probably nothing, which is the category where women who trust their husbands store the earliest evidence of betrayal. There were other moments in the weeks that followed, each individually negligible, collectively forming a geometry I refused to see clearly. He started going to the gym in the evenings, which was new. He had always been an early morning person, up at 6, coffee made before I was even awake, claiming the evening was for winding down. Now he came home at 8 or 9, showered and quiet, smelling faintly of something clean that was not quite the soap I recognized. He bought new clothes, nothing extravagant, just subtly better than his usual. A well-cut charcoal sweater, leather shoes that were polished, a slim dark jacket that fit him in a way that suggested he had actually tried it on with someone watching. He laughed more easily in general, which I told myself was encouraging. Evidence that whatever low-grade misery had been settling over him was beginning to lift. I interpreted every symptom of his renewed energy as proof that our marriage was improving. I was spectacularly, willfully wrong. he was also, and this is the part that took me the longest to make peace with, kinder to me during those months than he had been in years. Not warm exactly. Warmth implies spontaneity, and what he gave me was more deliberate than that, more measured, the kindness of a man managing his conscience rather than expressing his heart. He asked about my work projects and remembered the details. He made dinner on weeknights without being prompted. Nothing complicated, just pasta with good olive oil or a roasted chicken from the deli plated properly with candles lit. He suggested we take a weekend trip upstate in March, which we did, and which was genuinely pleasant, and which I have since understood was his way of giving me, something good to hold on to before he burned everything down. He was being kind the way a person is kind when they are about to cause tremendous harm and are trying, in whatever small ways are available to them, to offset the damage in advance. I found out later that he had met Natalie at an industry conference in Atlanta the previous April. She was a colleague of a colleague, younger than me by 6 years, working in risk consulting, apparently possessed of the particular gift of making Marcus feel interesting in a way he had quietly decided I no longer could. I don't say this with bitterness, though for a long time I did, though there were months when the thought of her made something in my chest feel like a closed fist. I say it because I have eventually come to understand it as simply true. She reflected something back at him that he had stopped being able to find in the life we shared, and rather than examining what that meant about himself, he chose to pursue the reflection. They had been seeing each other for nearly 10 months before the afternoon I reached into the pocket of that jacket. 10 months. Long enough to build something real, and he had built a plan. Organized, methodical. The kind of plan that a man who works with risk and contingency creates when he has decided the variables of his life need to be restructured. He had a timeline. He had already secured the storage unit. He had moved out boxes of books, a framed photograph from his study, the good winter coat I had assumed was at the dry cleaner, his grandmother's pocket watch from the drawer beside the bed. He had been taking himself apart from our life, piece by piece, with the quiet efficiency of a man who has made his decision and is simply waiting for the agreed-upon moment to announce it. That moment was supposed to be that evening. He had planned to tell me after dinner. He had rehearsed it. He collapsed at 6:47. I know the exact time because I looked at the microwave clock when I heard the sound. Not the dramatic crash of the movies, just a soft, abbreviated thud, the sound of something large becoming suddenly and wrongly horizontal. And I walked from the hallway into the kitchen and found my husband on the tile floor. One hand pressed flat against his chest, his face a color I had no name for, and in his eyes an expression I had never once seen there in 7 years of knowing him, pure, unguarded terror. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes, which I know because I counted. Not out loud, not consciously, but in the way that the mind, when it cannot process the enormity of what is happening, fixes itself on something measurable and holds on. I counted seconds. I kept my voice steady when I spoke to the dispatcher. I told her his age, his symptoms, that he was breathing, but his breathing was shallow and his color was wrong. I gave her our address clearly, including the cross street. I did all of the correct things with the calm, detached efficiency of someone operating on autopilot, while the real part of themselves, the part that was simultaneously crumpling inward, stood somewhere slightly outside the situation and watched. The letter was still in my hand. At some point, I folded it and pushed it into the pocket of my own cardigan without thinking about what I was doing. the way you pocket a receipt without looking at it. And then the ambulance was there, and the paramedics were in the kitchen, and the evening became a series of rapid procedural events that pushed everything else temporarily out of view. They told me in the ambulance that it appeared to be a cardiac event. A significant one, they said, which is the kind of language medical professionals use when they mean serious but are not ready to say dangerous out loud to the wife sitting 3 feet away. Marcus was conscious by then, intermittently. He looked at me once, and I looked back at him, and there was something in his expression that I couldn't parse in the moment. Not just fear, but something more complicated, some private calculus happening behind his eyes that I did not yet have the context to read. I held his hand. His fingers were cold. I held his hand because he was my husband, and he was frightened. And holding the hand of a frightened person is what a person who is not a monster does, regardless of what they have just found folded in a jacket pocket, regardless of the fact that something fundamental had broken loose in the foundation of everything and was currently in free fall. I held his hand, and I did not say anything about the letter. I did not say anything at all. The silence between us in the back of that ambulance was the loudest thing I have ever experienced. The hospital was the particular kind of overwhelming that emergency rooms always are. Fluorescent lights that gave everything a flat, merciless quality. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee, and something underneath both of those things that was harder to name. The sound of other people's emergencies bleeding through curtained partitions. They took Marcus through a set of double doors almost immediately, and I was directed to a waiting area with plastic chairs and a television mounted too high on the wall playing a news program with the sound turned down. I sat. Someone brought me a paper cup of coffee I didn't drink. I put my hands flat on my thighs and stared at the middle distance, and very carefully did not think about the letter in my pocket. Because if I began to think about it, I would not be able to stop, and I needed to be able to function until there was more information about whether my husband was going to survive the evening. His mother arrived 40 minutes later. Her name was Diane, a compact, precise woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut close and the kind of posture that communicates at all times that she considers herself the most competent person in any given room. She and I had a relationship that I would describe in the generous version as cordial, and in the honest version as two people who had agreed to behave well for the sake of someone they both loved, without ever actually liking each other very much. She swept into the waiting area and went directly to the nurse's station before she came to me, which told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in her order of priorities. When she finally sat down beside me, she patted my hand once, briefly, the way you pat the hand of an acquaintance rather than a daughter-in-law, and asked what the doctors had said. I told her what little I knew. She nodded, brisk and contained, and took out her phone and began making calls. I watched her, and I thought about the letter in my pocket. I thought about the name Natalie, written in my husband's handwriting, on paper that had been folded and refolded enough times to show deliberate, repeated handling. I thought about the brass key and the storage receipt. I thought about the charcoal sweater and the polished shoes and the weekend upstate and every cup of coffee he had ever brought me on a Saturday morning. I thought, I need to know how much she knows. And underneath that thought, quieter and more dangerous, I need to know how much everyone knows except me. The cardiologist came out just before 9 o'clock. He spoke with the practiced, careful precision of someone delivering information that will rearrange a life, and what he told us was this. Marcus had experienced a serious cardiac arrhythmia, likely the result of an undiagnosed condition that had been developing quietly for some time. He was stable now. He would need surgery, not immediately, but within the next several days. He would survive in all probability, but his recovery would be slow, and his life going forward would require significant adjustments. Diane asked the technical questions. I asked when I could see him. They told me 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes were when I read the letter properly for the first time. I went to the women's restroom at the end of the corridor, locked myself in the furthest stall, and took the folded paper out of my pocket. My hands were steady. I noticed that they were steady and found it strange. I unfolded the letter slowly, smoothing it against my thigh, and I read it from the beginning, every word twice. It was 3 pages, handwritten on the good cream-colored notepaper Marcus kept in his desk drawer. The notepad I had given him as a birthday gift 2 years ago, I registered, with a specific and particular lurch. The letter was articulate and considered, and unmistakably the product of a man who had been composing it in his head for a very long time before he put it on paper. He told Natalie that he had never felt as seen as he felt with her. He told her that his marriage had been empty for years. He used the word empty twice. He told her that Clara, me, himself referring to me by name in the third person, as though I were a problem to be described rather than a person to be spoken to, was a good person, but that they had grown irreconcilably apart and that continuing would be dishonest to everyone involved. He told her that he had taken care of the practical arrangements, that he had already begun moving his belongings, that he planned to speak to a lawyer the following week. He told her, in the last paragraph, that he was not afraid anymore. "I am not afraid anymore," he wrote. "Tonight I will finally be free." I sat with that sentence for a long time. The fluorescent light in the restroom hummed. Someone came in and washed their hands and left. I sat with "Tonight I will finally be free," and I felt something happen inside me that I do not have a precise word for. Not grief exactly, not rage exactly, but something that encompassed both and went further than either. Something cold and very clear, like water that has been still for so long it has become almost solid. I folded the letter back along its existing creases, put it in my pocket, and washed my face at the sink. The woman in the mirror looked the same as she always did. I found this surprising. Marcus was propped slightly upright in the hospital bed when they let me in, attached to monitors that beeped with steady, unremarkable patience. He looked diminished in the way that people always look diminished in hospital beds. Smaller, younger, stripped of the particular gravity that upright bodies carry. When I came through the door, he looked at me and immediately looked away, which told me, with a clarity that nothing else could have provided, that he knew I had found something. His eyes went to my cardigan pocket. Just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. 7 years of sharing a life with someone teaches you the grammar of their face, whether you want to know it or not, and the brief flick of his gaze to my pocket was a sentence. I pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. We didn't speak for almost a full minute. The monitors beeped. Down the corridor, someone was being paged on the intercom. I looked at him, and he looked at the white blanket folded across his chest, and the silence between us was a third presence in the room, dense and aware. It was Marcus who finally broke it, which surprised me. I had expected him to wait me out, to force me to begin, to make me be the one who named it. Instead, he said very quietly, not looking up from the blanket, "Clara." Just my name. Nothing attached to it. Just my name in the voice of someone who has used up all their other words. "I know," I said. My voice was completely level. I had not planned for it to be, but it was. "I found the letter." He closed his eyes. The muscle in his jaw tightened. When he opened them again, he was still not looking at me. "I'm sorry," he said, and I could tell from the way he said it that he meant it genuinely, that this was not a tactical apology, but an actual one. The apology of a man who is ashamed, who's been caught in the full architecture of his own deception and has nothing left to work with but raw, unstrategic remorse. That made it somehow both better and worse, easier to believe and harder to know what to do with. "How long?" I asked. 10 months. I had already known it was 10 months from the letter, but hearing him say it out loud did something different than reading it had done. 10 months is not a mistake. 10 months is not a moment of weakness or a brief, terrible lapse in judgment. 10 months is a relationship. 10 months is a parallel life. 10 months means that while I was planning our weekend upstate and being grateful for the candles at dinner and telling myself our marriage was healing, he was somewhere else entirely. In another apartment with another woman, building another future that had my erasure at its center. "Did anyone else know?" I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation was its own answer, but I waited because I needed to hear him say it. "My sister knew," he said finally, "and..." He stopped. "And my mother." The beeping of the monitors continued its indifferent rhythm. I sat very still. His mother, the woman who was currently on the phone in the waiting area, making competent arrangements, who had patted my hand once and called me dear in a tone that always carried a faint edge, like a word being used slightly wrong. His mother had known for 10 months that her son was planning to leave me, had possibly been helping him plan it, had sat across from me at a dinner table and known and said nothing, and continued, every single time, to call me dear. "What did your mother know exactly?" I said. He shifted against the pillow, and the monitors registered the movement with a brief, anxious spike. "She helped me find the storage unit. She thought I should talk to her lawyer first. About the house." There it was, the thing underneath the thing. I had assumed the worst was the affair. The 10 months, the letter, the parallel life. But the storage unit, the lawyer, the house, that was a different category of worst entirely. That was not simply a man who had fallen in love with someone else and was trying to find his way out. That was a man who had been quietly, systematically preparing to strip away everything we had built together, with assistance, with legal counsel, with the careful strategic guidance of his mother's attorney, while I went to work every morning and came home in the evenings and cooked and planned and had absolutely no idea. My hands were still steady. I noted this with something approaching wonder. "And the house," I said. "What was the plan for the house?" He didn't answer immediately. Outside in the corridor, a cart went by with something rattling on it, metal against metal. He was looking at the blanket again. "Clara, what was the plan for the house, Marcus? We thought that since we both contributed to the down payment, a lawyer could help negotiate." "You were going to force a sale." He didn't deny it. He didn't say anything at all, and his silence in that moment was the most damning thing I had heard all evening. More damning than the letter, more damning than the name Natalie, more damning than 10 months. He had not simply been planning to leave me. He had been planning to take half of everything, Our house, our savings, the accumulated proof of 7 years of building and sacrificing and believing, and divide it into legally enforceable portions, and walk away with his share toward a new life while I was left standing in the debris with whatever the lawyers decided I deserved. I stood up. I straightened my cardigan. I picked up my bag from the back of the chair. I looked at my husband in his hospital bed, and I said very quietly, with the precision that comes from being absolutely certain of every word, "Get some rest. We will talk when you are out of surgery. But I want you to understand something right now, tonight. I know about the letter. I know about Natalie. I know about the storage unit and the lawyer and the house. And before any of that conversation happens, I will have spoken to my own attorney." I walked out. The door swung shut behind me with a soft, definitive click. I did not cry that night. I want to be clear about that, not because it makes me impressive or strong, but because I think it is important to understand the particular state I was in. The cold, glass-clear state of a person whose grief has not yet arrived and who is, in its absence, operating on something else entirely. I drove home from the hospital at 11:15 with the radio off and the windows cracked despite the November air, and when I turned onto Maple Creek Drive and saw the yellow house with its dark windows and its porch and its 2 rocking chairs, I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as a door closing, not slamming, closing. Quietly and deliberately and with a finality that I understood even then was permanent. I went inside and I did not make tea or pour wine or do any of the things a person is supposed to do when their life has just detonated beneath them. Instead, I went directly to Marcus's study, turned on the desk lamp, and began going through his things with the focused, systematic calm of a woman who has decided that knowledge is the only currency she can trust anymore. The legal pad was in the second drawer, beneath a folder of financial statements, 6 pages of handwritten notes, bullet points and timelines and dollar amounts, his lawyer's name and phone number at the top with a circle around it. The storage facility receipt was there too, a duplicate, and at the very back of the drawer in a manila envelope that was not sealed were printed emails, 15 of them, between Marcus and his mother, spanning 8 months. I sat down in his desk chair and I read every one. What I learned from those emails changed the shape of what I understood to be true. Diane had not simply known about the affair and kept quiet out of loyalty to her son. She had been an active participant in the planning in a way that was methodical enough to make my skin go cold. It was her idea to consult her personal attorney, a man named Gerald Pierce, before Marcus told me anything, to establish in advance what a divorce settlement might look like, what Marcus's entitlements to the house would be, what a court might consider a fair division of assets. It was Diane who had suggested the storage unit, who had helped him identify which items from our home were his alone and which were jointly owned. It was Diane who had written, in one email dated 7 months ago, "The important thing is that she doesn't find out until everything is in position. Once she knows, she'll become difficult. And the longer you have before she lawyers up, the better. The longer you have before she lawyers up, the better." She had been racing me to a legal starting line I hadn't known existed on behalf of her son, with the serene confidence of someone who had never once considered that I might be capable of running. I photographed every email with my phone. I photographed the legal pad and the storage receipt. I put everything back exactly as I had found it, and I turned off the desk lamp and I went to bed. I did not sleep, but I lay in the dark with my hands folded on my chest, and I let myself feel, just for that one private night, all of it. the grief, the humiliation, the specific and almost physical pain of realizing that the kindness he had shown me in those final months had been a performance of conscience rather than an act of love. I let myself feel it fully because I understood that I could not afford to still be feeling it in the morning when the real work would begin. At 7:30, I called my friend Rachel, who had been my closest friend since college, and who was, by professional coincidence, a family law attorney. She answered on the second ring, because Rachel always answers on the second ring, and I said, "I need to talk to you today, not as my friend, as my lawyer." There was a pause, and then she said, "I'll be at your house in an hour." That was all. That was enough. Rachel arrived with coffee and a yellow legal pad of her own, and I told her everything. The letter, the hospital, the conversation with Marcus, the emails in the drawer. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her great professional gifts, and when I had finished, she was quiet for a moment, tapping her pen against the pad. "Okay," she said, "here's what we're going to do." She was precise and she was thorough, and she was, underneath the professional composure, quietly furious on my behalf. I could see it in the controlled flatness of her voice, the way her jaw was set. She told me that the most important thing, immediately, was to establish my position regarding the house. She told me that Gerald Pierce had not yet filed any motions because Marcus had planned to inform me first and initiate the process voluntarily, which meant I had a window, small but real, in which I could act first. She told me to change the digital passwords on all joint accounts. She told me not to speak to Diane again without her present, and she told me something that I wrote down and have kept. You are not behind. You are simply starting. Starting is not the same as losing. Marcus's surgery was 4 days later. It went well, medically speaking. The arrhythmia was corrected, the prognosis was good, and the cardiologist told me that Marcus was likely to make a full recovery. I visited once before the surgery and twice after, because he was still my husband in the legal and human sense, and because abandonment, even justified abandonment, is not something I am capable of. Diane was there both times, positioned at the bedside with the territorial precision of a woman who has decided that her son's hospital room is her domain and that I am a visitor requiring supervision. She was polite to me with the specific, effortful politeness of someone who knows what they have done and is calculating how much I know. I was polite back. I gave her nothing. The conversation that broke open everything happened on the second post-surgery visit, when Marcus asked his mother to give us a moment alone, and she left reluctantly, with a look in my direction that she probably intended as reassuring, and that landed as its exact opposite. Marcus looked better. Still pale, still diminished, but more present, more awake. He looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, "about everything, about what I put in motion." He stopped. His hands were on the blanket, and I noticed they were not still. I think I had convinced myself I was unhappy because it was easier than admitting I was scared. I let his words settle in the room for a moment before I answered. I had thought about what I would say if he said something like this. "Marcus," I said, and my voice was quiet and even, "what you felt is real. The fact that you were scared doesn't change 10 months. It doesn't change Natalie. It doesn't change your mother's emails or the storage unit or the fact that you were going to force the sale of our home without telling me until everything was already in position." I paused. "I am not angry at you anymore. I want you to understand that." The anger passed. What I am is clear. And what I'm clear about is that we are not the same two people we were before you made those choices, and we cannot go back to being them." He didn't argue. That, more than anything, told me he had heard me. The real me, not the version he had been managing around for a year. He nodded slowly, and he said, "What do you need from me?" And I told him. I needed full financial disclosure immediately. I needed him to instruct Gerald Pierce to cease all preparation on his behalf, in writing today. I needed him to tell his mother, in front of me, that she was no longer involved in any decisions related to our separation, and I needed him to understand that whatever came next, whatever shape our lives took from this point forward, it would be honest. We were done with the architecture of careful deception permanently. He agreed to all of it. I believe he meant it. The conversation with Diane happened 2 days later in the hospital family lounge, a beige room with uncomfortable chairs and a small window overlooking the parking structure. She arrived expecting, I think, an ordinary, uncomfortable exchange, the two of us circling each other with brittle courtesy, nothing named, nothing resolved. What she got instead was Rachel, sitting beside me with a legal pad and a recorder placed visibly on the table, and a printed copy of her own emails to her son, arranged in chronological order in front of her chair. She sat down. She looked at the emails. She looked at me. The composure she had worn for 7 years went through something I can only describe as a structural failure. Not a collapse. Diane was too controlled for collapse, but a visible cracking along the seam where performance meets reality. "These are private," she said. Her voice was steady but smaller than I had ever heard it. "They were," I said. "Marcus shared them with me voluntarily. I told her I was not going to pursue legal action against her specifically, provided she withdrew from all involvement in the divorce proceedings immediately and permanently. I told her that if Gerald Pierce filed a single motion before Rachel and I had been formally notified and given the opportunity to respond, I would submit the email chain to the court as evidence of coordinated financial concealment, which Rachel had already confirmed was directly relevant to the question of asset division. I told her, finally, that I bore her no lasting ill will, and I meant this, which perhaps surprised us both, but that the version of events in which I was the uninformed party who could be quietly outmaneuvered was over. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said stiffly, "I was trying to protect my son." And I said, "I know. And he didn't need that kind of protection. He needed someone to tell him to be honest with his wife." She had nothing to say to that. She left shortly afterward, and the composure she left with was not the same composure she had arrived with. It had new cracks in it. I suspect they were permanent. The divorce took 11 months. It was not clean. No divorce with a house and 7 years of intertwined finances ever is. But it was honest, which is all I'd asked for. We divided the assets fairly, without the maneuvering that Diane had set in motion, and I was able to stay in the house while I reorganized my finances. I repainted the kitchen. I got a dog, a large, good-natured one named Bernard, who took over the left-hand rocking chair on the porch without being invited, and has maintained that position with great conviction ever since. I had dinners with Rachel, and I took a trip to Portugal that I had been postponing for years, and I started going to the Saturday morning farmers market in the way that newly single women sometimes do when they have recently recovered their own schedule and find, with surprise, that they enjoy it enormously. Marcus and Natalie did not stay together, as it turned out. I heard this from Rachel, who heard it from someone in his office, and I sat with it for a moment and waited to feel something. Satisfaction, vindication, sorrow, and felt mostly nothing, which I took as a sign that I had processed what needed processing and moved to ground that was actually mine. I still make coffee on Saturday mornings. I bring 2 mugs out to the porch out of old habit, and Bernard drinks from neither and regards me with the patient, enormous dignity that large dogs bring to all situations. The garden is better than it has ever been. Both rocking chairs get used now, by me and by Rachel when she visits, and once by my father, who came to stay for a week in the spring and sat in the afternoon light and told me I looked like myself. I knew exactly what he meant. It had taken a year of very deliberate, sometimes painful work to get back to that person. The version of me that existed before I had spent 7 years softening my edges to fit around someone else's comfort. She was still there, a little older, considerably less surprised by things, ready, finally, for something that did not require her to look away. The letter is still in the drawer of my nightstand. I have thought about throwing it away and decided each time not because I need the wound open, but because it marks the precise moment when I understood that the life I believed I was living was not the life that was actually happening around me. The distance between those two things is always worth knowing. Fate had made sure I found out in time, and it turned out that in time was all I ever needed.